Welcome to episode 10 of the Bioenergetic View. I'm your host, Theresa, joined as always by Jay Feldman and Mike Fave. And I'm excited to talk about these clips today. I think people will also find them useful. Hopefully, the Holistic Psychologist made some interesting claims about mental health and insulin resistance, which I think there's a lot to unpack. Talking a little bit about how maybe there is no such thing as moderation when it comes to eating sugar, and going over a Q&A today about if you can live a healthy life without starch long term. So let's start with the Holistic Psychologist. In this post, she says, instead of looking at mental health issues as a chemical imbalance, we need to look at blood sugar levels and how insulin resistance plays a role, why this can help you heal. Studies show depression, anxiety, and even bipolar disorder are linked to how your brain processes energy, especially glucose. Your brain is the most energy-hungry organ in your body, and if it's not getting fuel properly, things start breaking down, and we start having mental health symptoms. Let's pause there and even just talk. Just for someone who's jumping into this, maybe they're just getting acquainted with metabolic health and mitochondrial function. Can we talk a little bit about how our body gets fuel properly and how the brain is using fuel and maybe how that differs from the rest of the body?
Yeah, I think that's a great starting place. So it's pretty well known, I think, that our brains use primarily glucose for their fuel in pretty much every state. And that glucose is typically going to be coming from the carbohydrates we eat in our diet. If we're not eating a lot of carbs, but if we're eating a lot of protein, we can convert that protein to glucose, and then our brains will use that. But if our bodies are fully deprived of carbs and if we're on a moderate protein diet as well, then we'll shift into ketosis and start to produce ketones, which can provide a portion of the brain's fuel, but it still requires some amount of glucose in the 30 to 40% of its total energy needs range. It's also worth mentioning the brain's per gram of tissue, one of the highest metabolic rates. And so we have a really high need for fuel in the brain. And obviously, as they're noting here, the fuel availability for the brain and how well it's using that fuel is incredibly important for how well we can think and our emotional state, and can also be related to mental health issues, as our brain touched on here. And I think I'm glad to see that gaining notoriety. And a lot of this post is coming, I think she references maybe toward the end or in the caption, something about Chris Palmer and his brain energy book. And, we did a podcast episode on that before from the Energy Balance podcast. But I think it's a really, I'm excited about the fact that concept is gaining notoriety, right? This recognition between the metabolic state of the brain and what's going on in terms of our psychological health, I think is a really important connection. The question will be, what after we've acknowledged that and we recognize that relationship, what do we do about it? How do we fix those metabolic issues, or what's the best solution? And I think that's where we tend to have the most disagreements with people talking about it. But at least, up until this point, just talking about those first slides, I think that's the most important thing to highlight. And I think it's something that most people don't realize. There's this association with being hungry and being angry, right? Feeling hangry, where people realize if they go a long time without eating, they're irritable and more easily upset and might be angry. And normally that's the extent of our thought process in terms of the relationship between what we're doing and our thoughts and emotions. But the reality is every single thing that we eat, the timing, the amounts, the balance between different foods has direct effects on fuel availability and how well that fuel is used in the brain. And so that can have a huge effect on mood, on depression, on sleep, on how we see the world. And so I think it's really great to see that being highlighted here.
I think when I look at this, I think one of the things that just in general, I think is very important is you have a psychologist who's recognizing that it's not chemical imbalance that's driving the problem. Because it's the same thing. You say chemical imbalance, what does that mean? Well, your serotonin is low, right? In traditional metrics or traditional perspectives, right? But it's why is it low? Does it just get low? Is it just randomly? Just happens to be low? Is it so there's an upstream reason on why these things are adjusted. And I think starting to look more upstream and say, why are some of these neurotransmitters shifted in these different circumstances? Why is metabolism adjusted in these different ways? What's going on with their hormonal systems? And starting to actually have a picture, a comprehensive picture, and looking at from a systems perspective of what's going on instead of just a singular reductionistic pathway, I think is a huge step in how this is being thought about. And I think, for us, it's kind of like Chris Palmer's book and the idea that energy metabolism is essential to a variety of neurocognitive and mood disorders. It's like, yeah, of course. Yeah, we agree 100%. But I think when you think about that in the context of the traditional models and theories that underpin the ideas around these disease processes, it's very reductionistic. Like it's only now that they're starting to relate inflammation, metabolic dysfunction, oxidative stress, and things like this with these disease processes instead of saying, hey, like your serotonin is just too low. And not even understanding like what serotonin's central role is in metabolism. And again, I'm not even saying that the low serotonin hypothesis, which we've covered previously, is the key here. I'm saying that I don't even think that that's the case. And I think the research, there's quite a bit of research now that's shifting and saying, hey, that this is actually not the case. It's not necessarily low serotonin that's the problem. It's potentially altered serotonin metabolism or high serotonin in certain circumstances, which is directly tied to metabolic states and stress states and the shift in other hormonal profiles. So I think seeing this is a good shift, and she has quite a big audience, so it's good for people to start to see these ideas. And then also, I think highlighting the essentiality and focus of glucose here is exceptionally important. It's just, we'll get to, and Theresa, I know you're going to read here in a second, it's just a weird like takeaway that we're going to get to after we recognize, yes, metabolism is key, and yes, glucose is essential.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. I was kind of cheering and marching along until, as we'll get to, I was surprised. So jumping back to the next slide, research shows that people with depression often have low glucose metabolism in key areas of the brain. That means their brain isn't efficiently turning fuel into energy, leading to fatigue, brain fog, and mood instability. Schizophrenia and bipolar disorder have been linked to insulin resistance, meaning the body struggles to regulate blood sugar, which directly affects brain function. A study from the American Journal of Psychiatry found that individuals with schizophrenia are 3 times more likely to have insulin resistance, further linking metabolic dysfunction to psychiatric disorders. 60 to 80% of people with depression experience significant changes in their glucose metabolism. So, instead of just looking at mental health issues as a chemical imbalance, we need to be asking, how is the brain getting its energy? Is blood sugar stable or constantly spiking and crashing? Is insulin resistance playing a role? Okay, Jay, jump in. What's this bringing up for you?
Sure. Well, I wanted to highlight again some things that I really like that were mentioned here. We have, it highlighted that in the brain in certain areas, in these, situations, there are problems converting the fuel into energy, converting that glucose into ATP. And that's something that I think I wish was talked about in every facet of health. We obviously all talk about it all the time because it's so central and it's central to the bioenergetic view, but I think it's so often ignored. And if we could apply this to every single organ system and the body as a whole, including the brain, I think that could lead to such great progression and advancement in diet and lifestyle and the alternative world and the mainstream world. Like, I think this is such a central piece. So I'm really excited to see it here. And there's also this kind of noted relationship with insulin resistance and problems converting fuel to energy. And I want to touch on that too, because that's not often considered to be the driving cause of insulin resistance. Normally there's it's this idea of you've just been exposed to too much insulin over time and your body got tired of responding to it and it gave up. And so now your tissues don't respond to insulin anymore and they can't take up glucose. But the reality is that this is driven by an issue with converting that glucose to energy. It builds up in the cells and then they can't accept more glucose. So you get insulin resistance as a result because insulin can't do its job. But yeah, I just wanted to highlight those two things. I love seeing that. Of course, we'll talk about the kind of extensions after this, which is where some of our disagreements will come in. But excited to see those things.
The one thing I think for me that when I look at here, I think where she says, that means their brain isn't efficiently turning fuel into energy, leading to fatigue, brain fog, and mood instability. I think that is a good like takeaway that you're not effectively taking the glucose and turning it directly into energy appropriately. But then when we come even here with these questions is how is the brain getting its energy? I think that's a fair question, but we know it's like a large portion of it under most circumstances is going to be from glucose. And under all circumstances, glucose is going to be a portion of that. Again, you could have some change with ketogenesis, but we'll talk. That's an entirely separate story. I don't want to go down that rabbit hole. But then the other thing is blood sugar stable or constantly spiking and crashing? This is where you're starting to get, I think, into a slippery slope here, where this side, because now it's like this has to be defined appropriately, because you're going to have a peak after you eat, and then you're going to come back down over a couple of hours later. Now, if you have a huge spike and then you drop fast, like, yes, that's not ideal. And if you're staying up all across the day, that's also problematic. But I don't think it's just as blood sugar spiking and crashing by itself the problem. I think a typical rise and drop after meals with carbohydrate would be like typically normal. And then we get into is insulin resistance playing a role here. And I think now like it's getting like a little muddier with the perspective. And I think the major point for me to focus on is the idea where she says here, the brain isn't officially turning fuel into energy, leading to fatigue, brain fog, and mood instability. That's where it's like, yeah, 100% agree. Problem with oxidizing the fuel, problem with utilizing the fuel. But now we're getting into these things are important in the context, but the way that they're typically interpreted, I think it starts to create an issue. And I think this is where you see the transition over, and you can see like how the line of thinking shifts, transition over to what we're going to get to with her recommendations.
Treatment for mental health disorders should focus on stabilizing blood sugar through more protein, less sugar, and more movement after meals.
This is where it's at. Is like the brain uses glucose. The brain is not the problem in mental health disorders is an inappropriate or the ability to oxidize the glucose to energy is off. Like there's something going on there. And then it's like solutions, eat more protein, have less carbohydrate, and then just move more. So basically, in all of these circumstances, you would be lowering glucose availability to the brain. I don't know how this fundamentally fixes what's going on in terms of taking that fuel source and converting it to energy. And then it's like, I guess, like how much more protein, how much more sugar, or how much less sugar, how much more movement? Like, what are we defining as sugar? Right? Because a lot of times people are saying, oh, sugar. It's like, yeah, the Reese's Pieces I had, the Reese's Cups, the pound cake. And it's like most of those foods are not sugar. As far as calories, they have sugar, but they're roughly 50-50 on sugar and largely polyunsaturated fatty acids in the form of cooked seed oils. And then what other ingredients are put in there. So it's like, this is where I think being precise becomes very important. And because we get this demonization of sugar and people are like, oh yeah, like that's what I do already. And then I think fundamentally, if somebody went on a really high protein diet with like a very low carbohydrate intake and then just did a bunch of exercise, I think that fundamentally would be a problem long-term for them. So it's, and the other thing is like the idea of just do more of this and less of that. I think we actually need to get to a point where we say, how much of these things are we actually going to do? I think those are the fundamental questions that we want to have. How much protein do we need to eat? How much carbohydrate do we need to eat? How do we organize our meal structure, our meal timing, our meal spacing so that we have a stable blood sugar across the day? How much movement and what type of movement are we going to do on a consistent basis? And then also, how do we, at the most fundamental core, how do we actually allow the cell to take the carbohydrate and convert that into ATP, convert that into energy? If that is the fundamental problem, how do we hone in and fix that specifically instead of getting platitudes about eat less sugar, exercise more, have more protein or something like this? Because this is where I think this is what I think creates a lot of the confusion for people is you see, okay, yeah, like I agree, like there's this problem going on. Like it's great to see this person talking about how metabolism is central to cognitive dysfunction. And it's like, boom, platitude answers as far as what are we supposed to do to actually resolve this issue. And they're not precise. And again, I know this is an Instagram carousel. So to be fair, it's hard to like give very specific components in an Instagram carousel by itself. But still, like, this is, I think, a little bit misleading as far as like what the solution is going to be.
I was even thinking about it in the context of people that are mentally unwell and, self-reportedly maybe struggle with anorexia or anxiety. They might be already very low carb. They might be eating a very low calorie diet. They might be moving too much. They might be having too much protein without enough carbohydrates. So I think it gets a little bit murky when we make these blanket statements. I know coming from a good place. I think the holistic psychologist really means well. And I think her attempt to be helpful was coming from a place of hoping to do good. But I could see this landing in a way that, confuses people even more. I think her intentions are pure. And then knowing that it's going to land, especially on people that are maybe in a more fear-based state of mind and thinking, okay, this person I really trust, this person that seems to be looking out for me, I better follow these ideas. And like you were mentioning, it's pretty arbitrary. Like, what exactly? More protein, less sugar? How are we classifying sugar? I could see it becoming maybe more of a rigid, strict, and a diet lacking in enough. Really thinking about having enough calories sometimes being the biggest thing that's holding people back. Yes, we need our macros and micros, but sometimes if someone's just under eating, they're at the point where they might be developing psychiatric and mental symptoms.
That's a great point. And I do think it's worth highlighting, there's a couple of things she's mentioned here that, especially when you're considering if this is talking to the average population who's probably under eating protein, the sugar that they're eating they're not even thinking about fruit as sugar. They're thinking soda and candy and things like that. Like if you were to offer those recommendations to those people, it probably would be a generally beneficial thing and would lead to maybe more stable blood sugar. And obviously the crux of the issue when it comes to issues with glucose metabolism in the brain is not necessarily just a blood sugar stability standpoint. And we don't just want to do anything we can to keep a stable blood sugar curve without regard to what it's actually doing in a deeper sense, because it can make things worse if we're running on stress hormones. And we've talked about those kinds of things in the past. But yeah, I think those two things could be interpreted as heading in the right direction for an average person. I don't like the more movement after eating meals, not because I think it's necessarily a bad recommendation, but again, without that extra context, I think it ends up pathologizing eating a little bit, right? It's like whatever you do, you have to make up for it with some extra exercise. Again, even though she's not saying exactly that, I think there's a little bit of that idea kind of seeping in here. And so I wanted to mention those couple of things, but of course, the most central point here is we're really not getting at the root of what is interfering with brain energy metabolism. Things like PUFA, which are heavily implicated, endotoxin coming from impaired gut health is heavily implicated, nutrient deficiencies. So those are the things that I think I'd love to hear talked about instead. And I am glad that she didn't just go the route of avoid all carbs, because carbs are the problem. And at least we're talking about the root. But of course, as we said, this isn't really the way we would go about trying to fix that issue. And if anything, avoiding the carbs by just having less sugar isn't actually fixing that underlying issue. If you're looking for strategies for fixing glucose metabolism in order to improve your mental and emotional health, or if you're looking for help resolving symptoms like chronic cravings and hunger, low energy or fatigue, joint pain, weight gain, digestive symptoms, brain fog, poor sleep or insomnia, hormonal imbalances and low libido, or various low energy conditions like autoimmune conditions, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, insulin resistance, or various other chronic health conditions, then head over to jfeldmanwellness.com/energy, where you can sign up for the free Energy Balance mini course, where I'll walk you through the best diet, exercise, and lifestyle strategies to resolve these low energy symptoms and conditions by maximizing your cellular energy. So again, to sign up for the free Energy Balance mini course, head over to jfeldmanwellness.com/energy.
So I think for me, like with this setup, the most important point is like, if somebody is having this problem, if somebody is having neurocognitive dysfunction and they're trying to stabilize their blood sugars, or I wouldn't even say stabilize your blood sugar, but basically convert the glucose effectively into ATP, into energy in the brain. And I think the question is what are things that we could do? What are the targets? And so I'd say we need to actually not just have more protein, The question is how much protein, right? So just addressing these specific components, so we could talk about some of the other areas. But again, like we've talked about in previous podcasts, 0.82 grams per pound. For carbohydrates, you don't necessarily want to have less sugar. You want to have an adequate amount of sugar for what your body's requirements are from appropriate sources. So that's going to be things ideally like fruits and tubers and different fruit products and things like this. And then the next thing is if you wanted to stabilize your blood glucose, well, I guess depending on who you ask, one way to do it is just never eat carbs. But obviously, like that flies in the face of what we talk about here, and also understanding the value of carbohydrate in general, and seeing that the problem is actually the conversion of carbohydrate to energy and not just the carbohydrate itself. So the question is, how do you stabilize? And that's just having your meals constructed appropriately. So having solid meals with the protein, carbs, fat in each meal, and have the appropriate amounts for what your system needs on a consistent basis. That is the best way. And then also making sure that the meals are structured so that you last the gap between the meal. The high spikes and crashes aren't just because of carbohydrate. If you just plow a whole bunch of juice in one sitting and you're having issues with conversion of carb to ATP, yeah, maybe you'll get a high spike and a high crash. But it doesn't mean that carbohydrate is fundamentally the problem. The fundamental issue is that conversion. And then so it's like the question is more fixing that. And adequate movement is like we need specific targets for this. Because then you have people going and putting on like multiple miles a week on the road running. And it's like some walking is fine. If you're having issues with blood glucose regulation, if you're dealing with type 2 diabetes, metabolic dysfunction, walking is fine. Adequately set up resistance training and stuff like this is also fine. And there's specific targets for those types of things. Because again, like there's a point where more of those things after a certain threshold also creates a problem. So you want to find the effective dose of some of these components for your certain context. And then again, I think the larger area to start to delve into is what's the blocks. And I think some of the major blocks in a lot of these disorders that we've seen from the research are micronutrient deficiencies, are things like excess oxidative stress driven by lack of micronutrients or exposure to things like polyunsaturated fats, inflammatory signaling, and then you can have different stress components and hormonal components like changes in thyroid function, changes in glucocorticoid signaling and things like this, and thyroid function that can directly drive some of these processes. So it'd be trying to figure out where the specific problems are and then addressing the foundation as a whole and having very specific targets for people so that people know like, okay, where can I go? What can I do? How much of these things, like what's my starting point? And then it's going to take some adjustment for your context, but at least having a clear starting point to start to make progress and start to improve the fundamental issue, which is conversion of carbohydrate, conversion of glucose into energy effectively inside the brain.
I was going to mention you two have a wonderful video on insulin resistance. And I think just having an understanding that sugar is not causing this, and just having a basic understanding of what's actually going on, you could read this advice and actually think, ooh, maybe someone needs more carbohydrates and maybe a little less fat with each meal, and definitely paying attention to their PUFA intake, but just adding some nuance. But Jay, what were you going to say?
Yeah, no, it's a great point. And that was episode 110 of the Energy Balance podcast. And I was going to mention Mike was suggesting some different macronutrient ratios and trying to get some specific targets there. And in episode 100 of the Energy Balance podcast, we went through our recommendations for all those things for anyone who wants to dig into that in more detail.
So let's see. Yeah. If you experience anxiety or depression, are you working on stabilizing your blood sugar level? A greater sense of understanding of their biology so that they can then start to fine tune. And yeah, everyone's coming from a different place. And if someone's eating 10 grams of protein a day and, less than 100 grams of carbs, they might really benefit from a high protein diet all of a sudden, and maybe getting out on walks. Like I think she was referring to the trendy idea of walking for 10 minutes after meals. That became pretty popular as a way to balance your blood sugar. And I think a lot of people do notice it makes a difference for them. The muscles take up that glycogen, they're ready to go, unless they've misinterpreted this as, oh, I should, take carbs out. And then all of a sudden that walk might actually be more of a stressful experience for them.
Yeah, definitely. And of course, walking after meals can be great, especially if someone's dealing with insulin resistance and they are struggling to metabolize that glucose. But it's, for someone who isn't, it's not like you need to make sure that every time you eat something, you have to go do some exercise or something like that.
Let's jump on to Layla's video.
How do you reduce sugar cravings in a way that's sustainable and consistent? There is no such thing as eating sugar in moderation. That doesn't exist. You have to cut it off 100% because it's one of the most addictive things in the world. It is like a drug. If you eat it a little bit, you will crave more. So you have to completely cut it off. Once you replace sugar with natural alternatives like raw honey, high-grade maple syrup, a good quality date syrup, or even coconut sugar when needed, you realize that you can satisfy every single one of your sweet tooth cravings with those options.
Ooh, okay. Mike, what are your reactions to this? I have a feeling you have a lot to say.
I was, when she first started the video, sugar is this addictive drug and you have to cut it off 100%. And so I was waiting for, stevia, monk fruit, allulose. Like I was waiting for these next things to pop up. And it's like honey, maple syrup, coconut sugar. There's some minor differences between regular granulated sugar and some of these compounds. Like honey will have some polyphenols. Maple syrup may have some polyphenol compounds, a little bit of thiamine, maybe a little bit of manganese. Coconut sugars, basically sugar to a large extent. So it's kind of just like, don't have sugar, but have sugar. It's like, it's a very weird, like, I don't know what the point is of, like, maybe these other sugar sources are better to some extent, but I think it's such a marginal difference overall that I don't think that, I think if you're going to use any of these sources, like you could also use granulated sugar as well. I think if you are dealing with metabolic dysfunction or things like this, then like I would say the recommended switch would be towards like whole fruits and maybe tubers and things like this, and not doing tons of these more refined or more purified sugar sources in the diet. But I don't think like you're going to say like, oh yeah, the best way to solve this is just replace sugar with coconut sugar. It's like, it's not really that big of a change. And I think as far as the addictive potential of sugar, I mean, I know they have some of the studies that like show areas of the brain that light up when exposed to sugar consumption. But I think it's you'd be hard pressed to call it or define it as a sugar addiction, right? Because as far as sugar metabolism goes, as far as carbohydrate metabolism goes, if anything, as long as you're effectively converting that carbohydrate into energy appropriately, then there's actually pure benefits to having adequate carbohydrates. And even in a circumstance where you're not doing that, still having carbohydrate on board, I think is exceptionally helpful. So I wouldn't necessarily call it an addiction, a sugar addiction, just because portions of your brain that you see other substances light up and have dopaminergic signaling also light up with sugar. I think it's conflating two problems, right? You have a circumstance where you have drugs like morphine, cocaine, and these different components that actually have problematic effects in the body, that have damaging effects in the body. Whereas like fruit juice and whole fruits and frozen fruits and even maple syrup and honey actually show benefits on the body. So I think what you're seeing in these circumstances is the body and the brain are basically saying, hey, like this, like we want more of this substance. It's having benefits for us. And I also, once you are having carbohydrate on a consistent basis, I don't think that you find that it's super addictive and that you have to have it or else like you're gonna go into withdrawals. So it's just the sugar addiction conflation is very weird. And then her solution here to just have these other forms of sugar that are pretty similar to the other source of sugar she's recommending, I think are, like, I don't know where it's coming from. It's weird. Like, I don't think it's that much of an alternative. It's like moving 1 centimeter difference, like relatively. So yeah, for me, it's just, the clip caught me off guard when those sources came out. I didn't really see what the massive difference was overall.
I thought it was a comedy skit at first because I'm like, wait a second. she's funny. But Jay, what was your take?
Yeah, well, I think, it's the reason why it's so jarring is it's like, if it's one thing if she was saying, look, refined sugar, it doesn't have any micronutrients, there's no vitamins and minerals, there's no plant compounds, there's no, polyphenols, and it's really bad for those reasons. It's empty calories. So instead eat dates or, use date sugar, or use maple syrup. that would be one thing. And of course, like that would make sense. That is the difference between those things. But instead, to take on the view that sugar inherently is bad, it's addictive, it is this really harmful chemical, and then you suggest alternatives that are all sugar is where the idiosyncrasy comes in. Like it just doesn't make any sense. And I think, to spell it out for anyone who's not particularly aware, because some people think like natural sugars might be different from refined table sugar that you're adding into cookies or something. The sugar part is really exactly the same. It's sucrose, which is made up of fructose and glucose. That's the same as what you're going to have in fruit. It's the same as what you're going to have in other carbohydrate sources in varying amounts, different amounts of glucose, different amounts of fructose, and different amounts of them being combined together. But it's all essentially the same. They're all coming down to those same simple carbohydrates. And so there really is no different in terms of the sugar component between coconut sugar and table sugar. That's really the same. The only difference is maybe a bit of polyphenols and a small amount of nutrients, but that really doesn't make much of a difference. So that's why it's such an interesting take, such a unique take. But then the other point that I wanted to touch on has to do with the addictive idea. And I think there's two things that are normally pointed to. One is once you eat it, you're not going to stop. And then the other is it triggers those pleasure centers, those reward centers in the brain. And in terms of like if you eat it, you're not going to stop. This is something that I think we all see with clients. It's somebody who's coming from avoiding sugar, and there's a lot of fear about bringing carbs in. And there is this idea that I'm going to eat the whole container of blueberries. I'm not just going to eat a few, or I'm going to, have the whole carton of orange juice or multiple glasses of orange juice in a day. And I think getting used to the idea that sugar and carbohydrates are a nutrient, it's a fuel, our body uses it, it's really supportive metabolically and helps to keep the stress hormones down and raise our metabolic rate and helps to fuel everything that you do, and is actually something that is supporting you. I think that shift really makes a difference and takes it away from being something that's addictive and rather a nutrient that we need, like water or like protein. No one would say I'm addicted to water because I drink a couple of glasses of water every single day and I can't go a day without it. And the same thing, on the flip side, you have the low carb people who talk about, sugar being addictive and they're all eating meat. And of course, if we were to go a couple days without eating any meat, you would really want to eat some meat. Like you would have some cravings for protein and you wouldn't just want a bite or two. You would want a whole steak, which is a lot, and it's the exact same pattern that you see with carbohydrates and sugar. If you deprive yourself of something that your body needs, of course, you have a desire to consume it. And so I think that's one thing to touch on, which is that our innate desire for it does not mean it's a bad thing. And the same goes for the fact that it activates those pleasure reward centers in our brain. Anything that is enjoyable and drives pleasure is something that will activate those same centers, right? And that's, relationships and having an enjoyable time with a significant other. It's watching funny clips from Instagram. It's, a sport that you're really into and enjoying in an intense way. All of those things trigger the same reward centers. I mean, that's what they're built for, is telling our bodies that this is something that we want to keep doing. Now, when you take something that's a drug and that it's an exogenous substance that we're not kind of normally exposed to, we're kind of hijacking those systems, it will preferentially activate those things. That's why we use it. That's why somebody would want to use some sort of drug that, causes pleasure. But it's not necessarily the fact that it causes pleasure that is the bad thing. It's just that's why we do it. That's why somebody might want to do it. But that is not in and of itself what makes the substance bad. It's how it does it and then all of the other effects that it has that are typically concerning. And that's, of course, not the case when we're talking about carbohydrates, where they have a lot of benefits in addition to triggering those pleasure centers as they're supposed to. That's what tells us that this is something we want to continue eating to support our health.
The other thing I think is important to point out here is that fats also stimulate the same dopaminergic pathways in the nucleus accumbens as sugars. So it's like, if you're going to try to use a metric of you have this area of the nucleus accumbens associated with addictive properties. Well, sugar triggers that. It's like, so do fats. So it's like and in your diet, you're going to have some energy substrate. You can't have pure protein diet. You will die from doing something like that. You have to have either carbs or fats present in the diet. And if both of them are triggering the same pathways in the brain, triggering the same type of appetite stimulation and binging behavior, and this in animal models, they've tested this, then it's like, then it basically becomes meaningless to make this relationship and say, hey, well, sugar activates this area. It's like, well, fats activates this area as well. So I guess for me, when I hear that, it's like, it doesn't mean anything. It's more of a conflationary factor. and then take it into the context of what happens with carb metabolism in general and the benefits that it has versus some of the other addictive substances. It's like, even if it was an addictive substance, yet it had benefits for the body at large, it's like, who cares? Who fundamentally cares if the substance has benefits and you have a drive to eat this thing that provides you benefits? And I think I would argue that the reason that you're seeing some of the lighting up in these pathways with consumption and energy substrate is because your body is saying, hey, here's energy substrate, here's fuel source. Let me seek out more of that fuel source. It would make sense that we have a drive to seek out more fuel source or more components in our diet and in our food supply that allow us to thrive and function at a better level. So I think fundamentally that I don't think the argument holds water when you look at some of the other data and also some of the studies that are set up in rodent models to actually induce this, actually force the rodents into circumstances where they would naturally be put into binging behavior. And this is actually something that I talked about with Paul on his podcast, that the studies are set up to actually create this problem. And you see a lot of other substances also trigger this pathway in the diet. So that's something that I think is important to keep in mind when you start to see arguments made like this. And again, the other thing is that insatiable drive to eat carbohydrate, once you have carbohydrate consistently in the diet, like it doesn't happen anymore. It's the same thing with salt. I think when, at least I've experienced myself and clients, when you shift the diet and you have carbs, you have some fats, you have adequate protein, you have salt in there, it's like, oh wait, I actually don't crave anything. Like I don't have these heavy cravings anymore. When you're doing when Jay, you and I used to be doing the low carb stuff, right? When we were doing the keto low carb stuff in college together, I remember we would make those coconut flour cookies, and it was like, you'd put the sugar in. It was like the one day a week we were gonna have them, and it's like we would just kill all of these coconut flour cookies, and I'd be so full because we were doing them with coconut flour because it wasn't grains, and then it had all this fiber, and so you couldn't eat that many, but it would still eat all these cookies, and it's like it was like, wow, like the sugar is just so addictive. Like we have to make these things that are gonna fill us up and have all this fiber and minimize the effects. And then now it's like you have carbohydrate in a diet on a regular basis. Like I don't really crave carbs. I'm not sitting here jonesing for these coconut flour cookies anymore, or for rice, or for fruits or stuff like this, because they're already present in the diet. So I don't think it's like other drugs either, where it's like you have this continual drive to use the drug, like cocaine or morphine or fentanyl or something like this. I think there is a point of saturation. And I think that's especially the case if you were to use carbohydrate sources like whole fruits, frozen fruits, 100% juices, things like this. I would argue for those over granulated sugar most times, as well as over some of the other sources that this individual has mentioned. So I'd argue those are probably top of the pyramid for me, but it doesn't mean that you can't have these other things either. It's just that if you're going to make the bulk of the carbohydrates in your diet, if you're going to choose the bulk of the carbohydrates in your diet, I would use those other sources again, because of the vitamins, because of the minerals, because of the polyphenolic compounds, things like this. They'll have a better effect overall. But again, fundamentally, that doesn't mean the problem is sugar in and of itself. The sugar is fundamentally beneficial. It's just, if you could get all the other stuff with it, it's like win, 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 win across the board.
I've seen a few times where people are still under the mindset or slightly brainwashed that sugar is dangerous and that it leads to diabetes and all these damaging effects. So they will restrict throughout the week. I mean, I have clients that are still thinking this way. I have family members, and it's interesting to see how they frame it as something they need to withhold. And then, yes, they get to the point where they feel like they are out of control around it because they're framing it as something they shouldn't have. Versus, like Mike, you mentioned, it's if we, boost the carbohydrates in general and are getting everything else in balance, the body doesn't tend to have these ravenous, almost like werewolf moments where people can't control themselves. It's a well-fed body. Yeah, I think cravings, like small cravings, are natural. Just even thinking about like seasonal shifts and maybe wanting the texture of something like chocolate or sweet potato or something starchy, but to feel out of control or addicted to something, there might be more to look at. And even just thinking about basics in terms of, are you eating enough? Are you eating frequently enough so that your body feels safe enough to not lose control and to go on a wild binge. Just expanding beyond just blaming the sugar, I think, is always a good idea.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. We're already at the Q&A. Okay, Zach. Do you think someone can be healthy long-term with no starch? I have been carnivore for a long time due to gut issues. It has helped, but I know not ideal long-term. Trying to integrate more carbs and don't do well with starch and a lot of fiber. Are fruits, juices, honeys, syrups, sugar, milk fine for carbs? Jay, what do you think?
Yeah. So, I mean, just taking the question fundamentally as it is, do we think someone can be healthy long-term without starch? I think, well, I won't speak for you guys, but I would say definitely. I mean, there's no inherent need for starch. We can get all the carbs that we need from fruits and juices and milk, honey, maple syrup, as he was saying. And so, and I would say for a lot of people, that can be really, really therapeutic. That can help, especially if we're dealing with gut issues, especially if we're coming from carnivore. I would say most people do better on the sugar side than on the starches side. There are large, there's still exceptions there. It's just a majority. I wouldn't say it's everybody, and some people do great with the starches. But I think a lot of people see alleviation from health issues by including the sugar-based carbs without the starches. It can be better for digestion, can be better for brain fog and weight and things like that. However, I would also say that we generally want to get to a point where we can have starches and digest them well and metabolize them well and not have any issue with them. And they can be incorporated as a really healthy part of our diet as well. And so even though there might be a period of time where we do better without starch, we want to be able to see improvements to a place where we can bring it in if we'd like. And obviously there's a lot of really healthy starchy foods as well, especially the root vegetables that have a ton of nutrients and polyphenolic compounds in there, potatoes and sweet potatoes and parsnips and carrots and things like that. So that would be kind of the broad overview I'd be thinking about here. If you're feeling really good without the starches, personally, I would say stick with that for now. Maybe work on the gut side of things, see if we can improve the microbiome there, because that might be a bit of an issue. And then you can see later on if you can incorporate those starches, but I wouldn't rush it. And, healing and recovering takes time, as all of us know and have experienced ourselves, coming from different iterations of low carb and having our own health issues. And so I bet with time, having more fibers, having more starches won't be an issue. And we do want to get to a point, I would say, where we can incorporate more fiber containing foods in, because that is really helpful for maintaining a healthy microbiome and keeping, the kind of beneficial microbiota in a good spot and keeping away the harmful ones. So that'd be my take here.
Yeah, I think as somebody who hasn't eaten very much starch in the past decade, I think it's very much possible that you can have a very low starch diet. I've actually posted my lipid panel, my body comp, and then also my blood glucose regulation values publicly in videos online. So you can see those, like what it looks like, at least just N=1, to be fair, on a basically very low starch diet over an extended period of time. Blood glucose regulation's fine, lipid panel is fine, and my body comp is pretty good. Right now I'm sitting around 10% body fat or so, at least based on a bioelectrical impedance scan. So you can definitely be weight stable, insulin sensitive, and have like a non-atherogenic lipid profile while having minimal starch in your diet and being on a high carb diet. Because basically I'm around 400 to 450 grams of carbs a day, and that's entirely from sugars almost. I'm doing pretty well, like exceptionally well with that. I think that there's differences in the ability to actually tolerate starches for different people. So I think there's a spectrum. I have some clients, 100% sugars, do way better with that, feel better, don't get sleepy after meals, don't have digestive issues. Some clients don't do well with sugars at all, do mostly starches. And so I just, based on what the person's responding well to and where they're at, I'm adjusting. And then I would say the vast majority of people do well with kind of a mix. So they'll have at a meal, potato, rice, whatever their meat's going to be, maybe some cooked veg, carrots, squashes, peas, things like this, and then maybe some juice or a side of fruit, depending on what's going on with their metabolic function. If you're dealing with type 2 diabetes, maybe slamming 16 ounces of OJ is probably not the best, because again, like even though the carbs aren't the problem, if conversion isn't working well, you may want to have a slower source coming in. So then whole fruit, I think, tends to be more helpful in those circumstances. Now, in terms of the carnivore diet specifically, it's actually coming off the carnivore diet is a trap a lot of times. And even Dr. Peterson Dr. Jordan Peterson has discussed this. He was in one of the podcasts, he was saying, I think, who was he speaking to? I think he was speaking to Dr. Ben Bickman, if I remember correctly. And basically what he was saying is like, why not just do the carnivore diet? Like then you get into a circumstance where you only have one variable that you have to work with meat. And then even in his own podcast, in his own line of logic, he goes on to say, well, maybe it's kind of hard to get off. And this is something that I see with quite a few people, is transitioning off the carnivore diet can be very difficult because of the gut symptoms that you have when coming off. And essentially what I think happens is while you're on the carnivore diet, what you can see is number one, you're dropping amino acids into the colon a lot of times. You're dropping bile acids and fatty acids into the colon. And these things can shift the microbiome in a negative way. So a lot of people are developing mast cell problems or histamine problems after carnivore. And I think the reason why is because the protein reaching the colon is selecting for histamine producing bacteria, because the histamine is produced from amino acid degradation. And they also produce putrescine, cadaverine, and components like this that can block diamine oxidase and then allow more histamine to sit in the gut. And then the secondary bile acids that are produced from bacterial fermentation can also drive dysbiosis and damage the colonic lining. So by the time you start to add in carbs, you have a circumstance where you have kind of a pathogenic or dysbiotic microbiome. A lot of people are going into carnivore anyway because they're having gut issues from starting from low carb. So they probably already have a dysbiosis. And then they're like, oh, like, see, I added in this rice and like I'm doing terrible now. And it's like, yes, because you still have a dysbiosis. Potentially it's worse. You haven't resolved that. And then what you find is like, oh, fruits and sugars tend to do better. And it's because they're absorbed higher up. I think people who are going on low carb, like for me, what I've come to after doing the full circle, like the around the world in 80 days thing, from like paleo and then carnivore, keto, bioenergetic, and then like kind of coming back and not like full bioenergetic with all the dairy and stuff because I don't do well with it, but still having carbs with the paleo setup, is that I think I just didn't tolerate starch from the get-go. And so when I went low carb, I felt 10 times better. And I thought, oh, it's just all carbs. And then you get the stress problems and things like this. And then essentially then I started adding in carbs, like, oh, these things got better. But when I tried to put in starches, it was a bad time. And then I did fruit sugars. It's like, wow, I actually feel way better. I don't have the problems of doing the starches and I don't have the problems of low carb. So I'm kind of getting the best of both worlds for my system, is that I don't have starches, but I still have carbs on board in the form of fruits and sugars. The other thing I want to mention is that the low fiber inside the carnivore diet, as you alluded to, Jay, is really problematic long-term, I think, because you have the shift in the microbiome, but the colon relies on short-chain fatty acids. And I made a video about this to produce, for energy metabolism, to pull oxygen out of the gut. So you leave oxygen in the gut, which shifts the microbiome towards bacteria that can actually use oxygen. So that can include some gram-negative bacteria and some potential pathogens. And then also, mucus production in the gut actually decreases, at least in animal models, when you don't have adequate amount of fiber, which means that your barrier against bacteria is really minimal. So then you get into a circumstance where just everything is knocking you out. So that's where you see like Jordan Peterson has impending doom for a month just having some apple cider. And it's because his system, the microbiome's off, and he's so sensitive to all the components coming in the diet that he's having these responses. And for me, that's something I experienced after I did this carnivore-esque setup, because I was like just on ground beef and cane sugar soda for like 6 months straight, just like couldn't eat anything else. That added in carrots, they're like kind of hit or miss, having bile acid diarrhea every single day, until I started to add in, first it was fruit juices, and then I started to add in some fruits, and then start to add in some cooked vegetable fibers. And it was a progressive process, almost like I was an infant redeveloping my microbiome with all these components over time. So I think the way that I typically go about this is start adding in the juices. They're easier to digest, not as much fiber. They'll lower the stress from carnivore or keto or whatever. They add polyphenols, which shift the gut. And then you can start to slowly ramp up the fiber sources. And whether or not you tolerate the starches, you got to figure that out. That's going to be person specific. A lot of times when you first start, it's no bueno. But then as you continue, like now I can eat starches. I can have potatoes. I can have some rice, but I just feel better when I don't have them. Especially if I have them every day, it starts to slow down my transit a little bit. And I prefer to have transit going on a consistent basis. So in that circumstance, I just stick with fruits. So essentially, there's going to be some personal adjustments here based on your context, but you could definitely get away with just doing sugars. And just, another thing is, in those videos, I talk about my uric acid. Uric acid's not high, no fatty liver, all this type of stuff. Because a lot of people, for me, I was scared of doing fructose for a while. That's something that I really had fear about. And then once I got over that and I was doing the whole fruits, I did way better overall. So I think my answer is yes, you can do this. And I guess it's kind of a long-winded way to kind of explain some of the things that are going on.
I definitely agree. It's kind of like learning how to eat again, transitioning off carnivore. And I would have Zach think about, do you want to be able to eat starches, and being open to the possibility that with time things will change? Because I absolutely see this. I saw it in myself. I see it with clients where your body might be progressing slower than you want it to, but you might be surprised, 6 months, a year from now, the foods that felt very problematic at first no longer trigger you in the same way. And I've seen similarly in the sense that people tend to react differently. I was one of the people that tended to feel a lot better with starches initially. To my shock and surprise, fruits were awfully triggering, especially for some of the SIBO-like symptoms I was having, whereas something like a cooked potato, really well-cooked rice, almost like a congee-like rice, was so much more soothing. And thinking of kind of that feeling of satiation as well, as I transitioned off of carnivore, there was something really grounding and deeply satiating about cooked potatoes and rice. And I didn't feel that way with, even pairing like steak, ground beef with some orange juice. And yeah, just honoring people are different. People's bodies, their microbiome are going to handle things differently. But hopefully, as the metabolic rate improves, like Mike said, recovering from the stress of carnivore, you might then notice that things start to shift and your tolerance improves with it. So right now, yeah, maybe fiber is not feeling so great, but be open to also to finding if specific fibers do work for you. Like something like a cooked pear might send you into a SIBO flare, but maybe something like papaya or kiwi or pineapple works perfectly. So I think, again, even thinking about some of the recommendations of like a low FODMAP diet or some of the fibers that have been warned against, putting that aside and really starting to gather your own data. How is your body handling these fibers? Yeah, I think not feeling like you need to just give up, and if you're someone that wants to be able to handle starches, that there's things to play around with, and so much of that is once motility starts improving, once bile flow is cleaning out the small intestine and you don't have these overgrowths anymore, your fiber tolerance will likely improve and you can start to expand what you're eating. But in the meantime, yes, maybe sticking with the foods that are not causing severe reactions, because that's kind of working against the main goal, which is to feel better. So honoring where you're at, but being open to things changing and getting better with time. Jay, do you have anything to add?
No, I mean, I think you guys hit it. And as you said, it's a matter of identifying what that balance is for us at this period of time. And on one hand, it can just be more time with implementing the bioenergetic approach. And maybe in other cases, we need to provide some more direct support for gut health or for other areas to be able to tolerate a wider variety of foods or be able to bring in some of those starches and fibers. But I think each of us has had our own kind of experiences here, right? And for me, I leaned very much on the low starch side early on. And then now it's kind of more 50-50 as far as my carb sources. And yeah, everyone has to, it's malleable, it's pliable, it's something that evolves with time. And that's part of the exciting part of experimentation. And, and again, I think it is really helpful to highlight that whether you're on more of the starch side or the sugar side or all the way on one side, that's okay. We definitely want to be getting as much carbs in as we tolerate effectively. And, even on that standpoint too, if you can't tolerate a lot of carbs right now, if you're at a lower carb intake, that's okay as well. Like that's a part of that journey and working in that direction. And we always want to put our experience as along and our interpretation of it at the top there. We don't want to be forcing something that isn't feeling good. So I think I would leave it there on my end.
Yeah. It's just a nice spectrum, right?
Oh, what's that?
I just said it's a nice spectrum because I was like, I'm all sugar, Theresa, you're all starch, and then Jay's kind of in the middle.
I'm like 90% starch, especially in the winter. I just noticed my fruit cravings plummet. Occasionally some pomegranate or, some orange juice gelatin gummies. But yeah, I think everyone's really different. Whereas my husband, he similarly to Ray Pete, could just have, orange juice and maple milk for months and feels quite satiated, which, yeah, I don't think that would work for me. But anyways, wrapping up today, Mike, where can people find you?
They can find me at my website, mikefave.com, on my YouTube channel, Mike Fave, and also they can find me on the Energy Balance podcast.
And I forgot to mention, I'll add this in. If people have any specific clips or that they want us to talk about, feel free to leave them in the comment section below, or you can email jay@jayfeldmanwellness.com. And where else can they find you?
Awesome. Yeah, that's my website, jayfeldmanwellness.com. And of course, they can find me here and on the Energy Balance podcast. And yeah, send in those clips and also any questions for the Q&As as well.
You can find me at Living Roots Wellness on Instagram and livingrootswellness.com or on Tapping with T. So awesome. I really enjoyed this, guys.